Good morning, everyone. My name is Chuck Cooper, and I'm the Vice President for Congressional and Public Affairs at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. On Wednesday, our board met, and today we're convening our quarterly public board meeting to discuss the board's activities. This is part of our ongoing commitment to reach out to our stakeholders and our ongoing commitment to transparency. And what we want to do with these meetings is to make them as much as possible an interactive session. So please feel free to ask questions, both of Mr. Johannes and of the panelists. We want to make sure that we're getting your input because that makes us better, and I think it strengthens our partnership. So please, please participate. It's a critical time for the MCC. We've concluded our first 5 compacts, and during that period of time, as we've concluded our compacts, we've learned lessons. And we've seen that we're making progress. We've seen that the model is working. And so we're excited about that. And we're producing very impressive results. These results and this progress are coming now at a very critical time for the agency. It's a time of great budget constraint. And so what we need to do is work with you, all of our stakeholders, to build awareness about MCC and get out the good news about the results that we are producing. So we invite you to work with us in that effort, to reach out to stakeholders on and off Capitol Hill, to share the good news about the work that we're doing and also the news that the model is working. So what I'd like to do is just give you an overview of what we're going to be doing today, what the agenda is today. First, we're going to be hearing from our CEO, Daniel Johannes, who is going to be giving you a summary or an overview of the board's actions at the meeting on Wednesday. He's also going to provide an update on developments, key developments at the MCC since we last met in March. And then we're going to have a panel discussion to talk about the board's action with regard to the reinstatement of the Niger Threshold Program. And we're going to have a conversation about policy reform and gender and how those two issues are so important to MCC operations. So with that, I would like to introduce our CEO, Daniel Johannes.
Thank you, Chuck. Good morning and welcome. Also like to welcome our board member, Ambassador Mark Green. Mark, where are you? Nice to have you. And before I get into what was discussed at the board last Wednesday, I'd like to provide you with a brief update about some of our key activities that happened since our last March meeting. I've had the opportunity to travel to 4 of our partner countries. I went to Armenia, where we have a $180 million compact, which is coming to an end this September. And at the end of the compact, this compact is going to benefit approximately 400,000 people, helping Armenia become food secure. So I was very pleased. I was there. I spent a lot of time with the beneficiaries. They told me their stories, how they were able to increase their income throughout the last 4 or 5 years. So we are extremely pleased with our compact in Armenia. We also added a new member to the family, Malawi, where we signed a $350 million compact. In fact, our Vice President for Operations, Patrick Fine, was in Malawi to sign a $350 million compact, primarily concentrated in the energy sector to help that country become energy secure. So it's probably one of the best developed compact, and with the compact, we have an excellent policy reform that's been undertaken by the government, which makes our investments extremely sustainable and also opens up opportunities for investments from the private sector. So we are extremely pleased with the beginning of our relationship with Malawi. I also had the opportunity to travel to Namibia, where we have a $306 million compact, primarily concentrated in education, tourism, and agriculture. And it is in the early stages of implementation, but let me tell you some of the amazing things that I saw when I was in Namibia. I traveled to the northern part of the country, where approximately 65% of the population lives, where you have the largest concentration of poverty. I spent time with kids. These are high school kids that were previously educated under a tree or in a room without a roof or no windows, where they had to share one textbook with 20 other kids. Just imagine, tell me how you're going to do very well when you have to learn in those circumstances. Today, so far, we have distributed about 750,000 textbooks, so each kid is able to have one textbook, so they don't have to share with 20 others in science, math, and English. I was able to see one facility where we finance, where there are classrooms, there's roof, windows, there's some housing quarters for the principals and teachers. And I was told by the education minister, who was with me the whole time, the result, how they were able to improve the scores. And we have another 3.5 million textbooks that's going to be distributed between now and the next 12 months, helping the country become education secure. So I was pleased and I was really touched when I was speaking to the children. And then I went to Zambia, where I spoke at the AGOA Forum. My speech was primarily on how private sector partners could take advantage of the investments we are making in our partner countries in Africa. As you know, approximately 65% of our investments are concentrated in infrastructure and agriculture, which are key and vital sectors for trade and investment-related activities. So we want to make sure that investments within as well as investment from America are being considered when they think of our partner countries in Africa in particular. And then he gave me an opportunity to speak with President Banda. You know, we are in the process of developing a compact in Zambia, primarily centered in two areas, water and sanitation and ecotourism. And our development is moving very nicely, and we expressed to the president that we wanted to see open and fair elections, which is scheduled sometimes in August and September of this year. And then I went to Tanzania, where we had the opportunity to host Secretary of State Clinton while she was visiting Tanzania in one of our projects. Tanzania is one of the largest recipients of our compact at $700 million. Of the $700 million, $204 million is concentrated in helping the country become energy secure. And I'm very happy to tell you that the majority of the contracts are won by American companies. Two American companies, Pike Electric and Symbian Power. And what's even more successful about the story is they used the leverage to get in the market as the result of our compact. Symbian Power was able to buy a power plant to help the country become more energy secure. Again, they've taken advantage of our investments. They're going to be creating more jobs here at home, and they're going to be helping our partner country, Tanzania, become energy secure. So it's a win-win relationship. This is what we like to see. American companies taking advantage of the opportunities that exist in many of our partner countries. So I was very pleased with the outcome. And now, let me just give you a very brief summary for what was discussed at the board meeting last Wednesday. First, Patrick Fine talked about results framework. You know, at the MCC, when we talk about results, it's from the beginning. Countries that are performing their policies in order to be considered for our program, and those countries that are continuing to reform their policies while they're implementing our compact, and to the outcomes, the outputs, and finally the investments, ability to generate additional income to our partner countries. So we talk about on a continuing basis. It is our number one priority. It is what makes the Millennium Challenge Corporation relevant, is our ability to generate income and results. And for those of you that have been involved in the investment field, right, when you deal with investment, it is a risky business. I mean, I've done this for 30 years before I came to the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And some investments are going to give you above and beyond the desired results. Some are going to give you at the expectations, and some is going to be below. But because who we are a very transparent agency. We're going to tell you everything, the good and the bad, right? We're not going to cherry pick and tell you all the best stuff, but we're going to be able to tell you those investments in which we're not able to achieve. And we're going to learn from it, and hopefully next time when we do another compact, we will not repeat the same mistake. But nevertheless, because investment is a risky business, don't expect the entire investment to be 100% positive. Some is going to be below. So, but Patrick took us through the various scenarios. And then Sheila and her team, I believe Sherry Crum is going to talk about it today. We talked about MCC's approach to policy reform. Policy is in our DNA. It's what makes the Millennium Child Incorporation. We want those investments to be sustainable for a very long time. One of the best ways to do that is through major policy reforms, ladies and gentlemen. Otherwise, it's extremely difficult to help our partner countries. We cannot lead them to the path to become self-sufficient and generate investment from the private sector unless they make some major policy reform. So Sherry's going to talk about it in a few minutes. And then Jeannie Sides, where are Jeannie, who is the head of our gender program. Gender is also a major priority of the Millennium Child Incorporation. In fact, it is extremely difficult to achieve economic prosperity unless you have both men and women are equal champions of the development. So we put a lot of emphasis to it, and Ginny's going to talk about our success story in Nicaragua, a compact that just completed about a month ago. Even when I was in Armenia, I saw that 50% of the beneficiaries were women, at least the one I met and saw in their houses, whether it be in Honduras or Nicaragua and other places. I think what you see is women are also benefiting from our investments, not only men. And then finally, the board made a decision to reinstate Niger Threshold. As you know, Niger Threshold Program was suspended in December of 2009 after the president decided to extend his stay in power, and then we had a coup d'etat in that country, and the result, the Threshold Program was suspended by the board. Since then, they've had an election, and the new regime is in the process of implementing many of the democratic principles that matter to us the most. So the board made the right decision, which is to reinstate the threshold with Niger. Again, what happened in Niger is a classical example how our program motivates others to do the right thing. And not only Niger, but I have spoken to a lot of countries in the last 12, 18 months since I've been here that want to be considered for our program and are all doing the right thing in terms of reforming the policies. Of course, some of them may not be candidates today, but eventually they'll be good candidates one day in the future. But even if they don't get our investment, I think the key is that they are reforming their policies to create the environment and the condition for private sector investment in those countries. That's what matters the most. So with that, I'll stop here and I'll take a few questions before our panelists come to the front to talk about some of the issues I talked about. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I'm Sarah Jane Statz.
Hi, Sarah. How are you? Nice to see you.
Well, thanks. I run the MCA Monitor at the Center for Global Development. Can you tell us a little bit about how the reinstated Niger program will reflect some of the lessons learned from the last threshold programs? I know you have a nice piece of paper just outside that it counts some of those lessons learned, and I know there's the plan for next generation threshold programs. So wondering how it takes into account some of those ideas.
Okay, good. I think Sherry's going to talk about, but I think the new threshold program is going to put more emphasis on policies. Instead of trying to prepare those countries just so they could pass our indicators, I think this time we're going to try to find out what are the real constraints and emphasize on policy. And Sherry's going to talk to us in detail. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segera. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on empowerment of women. I want to thank you so much, Mr. Johannes, for the wonderful work you are doing and incorporating women into MCC, as I've been talking about. When you empower women everywhere in the world, you empower the whole community. So thank you so much for the wonderful work you have done to incorporate women into MCC. And how can our organizations, small organizations like us who focus on gender, work with MCC?
We are open for any ideas. We welcome good suggestions. In fact, we do have a website in our website called Innovation to Innovate, where we accept new ideas. So just, whatever new ideas you have in this area, please welcome to give us your new ideas. Thank you. I'll take one more question. Okay, sir.
Good morning. I'm Mike Gould with CH2M Hill. I'm just curious about what are the lessons that the MCC has learned from the early days to now? How are you doing things differently today that's different from before?
Good. I think that's a very good question. What have we learned from the past? A lot of different things. Number one, I think in early days, most of the compacts were done, and we really have not done a lot of the preparatory work. Today, which meant, so what does it mean? Because we have not done a lot of the preparatory work. We had to rescope some of the projects. So if we were planning to do 600 kilometers of road today, we're probably building about 300 or 400 kilometers because we really have not done the really detailed work that needs to be done early on. So today we spent a lot of time in making sure that a lot of the work is being done before a compact is signed, so we do not have to rescope the projects in the middle of the implementation processes. And this is one example. There's a lot. All right. All right. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it for being here, and welcome to stay and listen to our panelists. All right. Sarah, if you want to speak to me more, please come to the office. I have a lot to tell you, all right? Thank you. All right. Thank you. All right.
Thanks, Daniel, for coming. I know you have another commitment and have to leave. At this point, I'd like to invite our panelists to the table and introduce them to you. We'll first be hearing from Alicia Mandeville, who is a director in our Department of Policy and Evaluation, and Alicia will be going first. She also has a commitment, and so I think she'll be leaving, be able to take a few questions after her remarks, and then we'll move to the next panelist. And the next panelist will be Ginny Seitz, and Ginny is the Senior Director for our Social and Gender Assessment at MCC. And Ginny is going to be talking about our gender program, and particularly in the context of Nicaragua. And then we're going to be hearing from Sherry Cram, and Sherry Cram is going to talk about why policy matters at MCC and what specific tools we use, what policy tools we use to engage with our partner countries. So with that, I will recognize Alicia.
Right. Sorry. They warned me that this would be slightly different than normal and that we usually have these fixed, so if I look a bit awkward, I apologize. As Chuck mentioned, my name is Alicia Phillips Mandeville. I'm our Director for Development Policy. Our team manages the country eligibility, questions of country eligibility, so the annual selection process in December, as well as questions of suspension, termination, and then questions of reinstatement of programs. This is actually a really exciting meeting from my perspective in that this is the first time we've been able to talk about reinstating an active program that had previously been suspended. So to me, this is, I'm really pleased to be able to talk about the decision to reinstate the Niger Threshold Program assistance. It's the arc of the story that's actually what I think is significant. It shows that not just the restoration of an elected government in Niger, but also that eligibility can come full circle. So it's possible for a country to be selected for good policies, to experience a period of problematic policy or problematic change and decline, and then to be able to restore its eligibility and restore a good policy environment and a good commitment to democratic institutions. So bear with me while I kind of give you the arc of the story, because I think that's the biggest takeaway. Niger was selected as a threshold program, as the CEO mentioned, in 2006. At a per capita income of about $240. It was significant that Niger passed all three of MCC's democracy indicators. That's something we really recognized. We signed a threshold program with them in 2008. It primarily focused on girls' primary education completion, but also some work in the anti-corruption area, as well as land rights and access. The program was proceeding, moving smoothly. In 2009, it became apparent President Tanja then President Tanja took a number of steps to try to extend his term in office. The legislature pushed back against this, and he dismissed the legislature. The Supreme Court pushed back against this, and he dismissed the Supreme Court. After a number of steps like this, it became clear to MCC that there was a clear pattern of actions in which the president was undermining democratic institutions. And MCC took a very considered decision to suspend them towards the end of 2009. In the months that followed, the military stepped in, arrested the president, announced that they would, over time, restore democracy within the year. Significantly, they took a series of very methodical steps to then restore those same institutions that we had previously seen the prior president take steps to undermine. So the first thing was to announce that no one in the military government would be allowed to stand for future election, or be allowed to stand in the next election. And that was significant because it showed us that the military was not attempting to cling to power. Secondly, they assembled a constitutional assembly that was a very participatory body. It included political stakeholders, civic stakeholders, traditional leaders, and all of the key stakeholders in Niger whose buy-in is critical for long-term political democratic stability. And they tasked this group with drafting a new constitution, something that addressed challenges in the constitution that had in part enabled some of the previous issues to occur at the end of 2009. That constitution then was approved by referendum by the people of Niger in October. They held local, parliamentary, and presidential elections, and in April of this year, President Nsofu was inaugurated. So the arc of the whole story goes from 2006 to 2010. But what the story kind of as a whole shows is that institutions change slowly. They don't change overnight. And MCC doesn't take decisions about eligibility overnight. We didn't reinstate the minute a new president was elected. We didn't reinstate the minute that transitional government talked about commitment to restoring democracy. So now we have a situation where, it's exciting to say that there is the restored government in Niger elected by the people of Niger. And MCC recognizes that and recognizes the significance of that. And the board took a decision to restore Niger's eligibility as well. So we're really pleased to have Niger back in the circle of MCC partners. And this is, like I said, if you can tell, this is an exciting kind of point. This is the first time that we've been able to see this full circle unfold. So I can take some questions now. I do unfortunately have a second meeting proceeding right next door that I'm supposed to go to. But if there are other questions that I can't take now, then my colleague Sherry could answer as well.
I'm moderating, so, go ahead.
Hi, Pablo Solora from the U.S. African Development Foundation. What are the sectors you're going to be focusing on this new program? And is there also some geographic areas going to be looking at around the Niamey region or up in the north, or where exactly?
So this is, I think, related actually to the question that Sarah asked earlier about the new lessons of the Threshold Program. And Sherry may be able to speak to this in more detail. For our purposes, this decision was for MCC to be able to re-engage with Niger. So we don't have actually a pre-designed program at this point. The Threshold team will take some time to consult with the government of Niger, consult with people and stakeholders there, and then design the program from that, with the goal being, in part, I believe, to apply some of the lessons that we've learned to date with previous Threshold programs.
I'll take it on during the discussion.
Hello, Ed Barber from Good Works International. I take it that Madagascar is nowhere close to restoring the program. Can you say a few words on that?
So I can't speak as well to exactly what's the specific political environment right now in Madagascar. We have not seen anything like the same steps, to my understanding, in terms of steps taken to address a non-constitutional transfer of power. I believe the High Transitional Authority is still in office. It's been, at this point, well over a year. That's actually, it does help throw into relief, though, why the transition in Niger is significant, in that there was a commitment to make that change, and then we saw those changes actually occur.
Thank you.
So much. I'm very sorry about that.
Thank you very much. I'm Ginny Seitz, and I'm very happy to say that I lead the team that works on social and gender assessment at the MCC. And I want to start by giving a tremendous congratulations and thank you to our CEO and our senior management, many of whom are sitting in front of me here, for the way that they have made this commitment a reality at MCC. And what I have seen, as you can tell, I've spent many, many years in this field. And what I see at MCC is a real change in the organizational culture around gender integration that I never expected to see in a development agency. So I want to thank them and say that we are working really hard to make gender analysis and ensuring that women benefit from our investments, and we're making it part of our standard practice. So I wanted to start with that because Nicaragua has taught us a lot about the best way to do that, and I want to give you some examples. First, the context within MCC's mission. We see women as economic actors, and we focus on incomes rather than rights. So our gender analysis informs economic growth projects rather than separate women-focused activities. By increasing economic opportunities for women, you not only improve their well-being and that of their families, but you increase the overall impact of our investments. And as I said, this has placed us in a unique place in the development space to do gender in a way that hasn't been done before. So why was Nicaragua successful? First, there was engagement from civil society, and as you know, MCC places great emphasis on country ownership and the engagement of civil society through consultative processes. And this was really important in Nicaragua because the NGO that started advocating with the MCC and with the Nicaraguan government was very concerned because other development projects that tried to grow rural businesses in the northern region had been unsuccessful in reaching women. In fact, typically less than 5% of the beneficiaries in these projects were women. The compact in Nicaragua also demonstrated what the U.S. Gender advocacy organizations, including Interaction, Women Thrive, and many others, have identified as the key requirements for successful gender integration. And these are highlighted in red on the slide. Looks more like brown, but it is supposed to be red. So there was leadership from both MCC and the MCA who worked with this NGO and who hired one of their leaders as a gender director, ensuring the capacity for gender integration on the staff of the MCA. They provided her with financial resources and gave her authority to hold contractors accountable for performance on gender. And using our gender policy as her mandate, MCC's gender director developed the first gender integration plan in an MCC compact. Now, we require gender integration plans in all of our compacts, and we also require that the MCAs have social scientists with gender expertise on their staff. So, what difference does a gender integration plan make in projects? In the $58 million roads project, it made a difference in design. In response to consultations with women, for example, the roads project paid careful attention to the social services and locating bus stops near schools and health centers. But women are economic as well as social actors, and in the roads project, the MCA expanded opportunities for employment for both women and men. Working with a local women's group, the MCA provided training so that members could do road maintenance and traffic control. The group later obtained legal status and now has government contracts to maintain other roads. The Rural Business Development Project had a target of 30% for women's participation, and this was achieved during the compact. It required moving against cultural assumptions as well as a decade of constraints in the agricultural sector that had pushed women out, or to the margins of the service sector. In fact, by 2005, only 8% of individual producers in Nicaragua were women. In the plantain component pictured on the slide, women were 48% of the beneficiaries. But what's really key is they moved into the entire value chain. They were no longer just hired as workers in processing plants. They were producers and business people. Without gender analysis, women were unlikely to qualify for the dairy component of the Rural Business Development Project because they didn't have sufficient assets. So the project developed flexible participation criteria, such as allowing women who did not own land to produce a document, such as a letter from relatives stating their use rights, as a basis for qualifying. In the end, the participation of women was so deep that they are now on the boards of milk collection centers and livestock associations. MCA Nicaragua was also highly successful in the land regularization project, with 72% of land titles going to women in a country where only 13% of land nationwide is owned by women. Nicaragua's success was not easy to achieve. The cultural dimensions of gender inequality in northern Nicaragua required specialized recruitment so that women could perceive of themselves as rural business people. Careful attention to gender integration across projects also led to greater acceptance of gender equality among the many stakeholders. And I think this is an advantage of the gender integration approach through economic development programs. The Nicaragua Compact has given MCC evidence on what works. It's validated our approach in focusing on the economic growth sectors, as well as the importance of a clear policy and other key requirements of leadership. The ones I mentioned before: leadership, mandate, capacity, resources, and accountability. The illustration above, done by a child for the cover of MCA Nicaragua's Gender Integration Plan, says that without the participation of women, there is no development. And we've heard that already today, so we're saying it again. Even though we know this, and even though there are many examples of projects that work for women, very rarely can we expect a development agency to consistently achieve success. By adopting detailed operational procedures and formal requirements for every compact moving forward, MCC is ensuring that gender integration is standard practice. So please go online and look for our gender integration guidelines, as well as our gender policy, to see how these operational procedures and milestones are changing not only our institutional culture, but moving the field along as well. We're seeing significant progress and innovation in the designs of the Indonesia, Zambia, and other compacts in development now, and I hope to be able to return to you in future with those stories as well. Thank you. Any questions?
Oh, okay. Yes. Good morning, everyone. While we're getting my presentation up, I'll just say how delighted I was to hear your question about lessons learned, because that places my my presentation perfectly in your interest. So I'll be talking about the lessons that we've learned in promoting reform. And last quarter we presented the lessons that we've learned on results, and there's a presentation on our website highlighting, how we've evolved. I'll also take the opportunity to invite you to look at the Principles into Practice series, which is on our website. This is a series that really focuses on the lessons that we've learned in implementing our key principles over the years. We have a paper on results that is available. The next paper is on ownership. And we have a number of sector papers coming out over the summer. And these really are the good and the bad and how we've evolved based on these lessons. So in terms of promoting policy reform, this is one of the CEO and senior management team's top priorities. And so we've been systematically over the last year looking at ways that we operate and thinking about how to innovate, how to build on our lessons, adopt new tools. And this has always been a core principle, but we're really trying to pursue it through a very targeted and purposeful approach. And this is because we know that investing in reforms increases the impact of our and development outcomes generally. And we're seeking also to leverage the experience and activities of others working in this space. We've learned that the prospects of MCC's seal of approval and potential for substantial resources have added huge incentives for countries to reform, making it a really valuable asset, not just to MCC, but to other agencies within the US government and other donors. And so I'm going to try to share some examples with you. The key here for MCC is how do we strategically leverage those resources for greater impact? So as I mentioned, we're innovating our support instruments, trying to match the right instrument to where the country is on the reform spectrum. And I'll walk you through some of our principles and some of the instruments. So I think you've seen these terms from MCC before. From our model to our practice, promoting reform is integrated into our relationship with all of the countries that we work with at their various stages of development. We invest in countries that have good policies, and then in carrying out our investments, we invest in those reforms. There are 3 principles driving our approach. Being selective, letting country performance drive our terms and our level of engagement, and a focus on results. So let me walk through selectivity. First, we're selective with the countries that we work with. These countries must themselves be committed to reform. And this goes beyond the initial selection to ongoing reform, not just on the criteria, but in our programs. What reforms we focus on really will depend on the diagnostic analysis that we're incorporating in the Threshold Program too. I'll come back to that. And how is about the instrument that we bring to bear and how we can calibrate our instrument to the level of reform commitment and to where the country is. So country performance, I said, drives these 4 instruments. So let me go through these instruments and come back to our last principle on results. The first one is selection and the eligibility criteria. We've learned that the scorecard is an effective entry point for starting a dialogue with countries about reform. It's become our brand and model for sustaining that dialogue over time. And we're trying to deploy it in new ways. One of the ways that we're deploying it is working with transitioning countries. So I'll be headed to Tunisia next month to work with the transitional government there. They've opened the doors for us to meet with senior people across the government that are formulating policies and approaches that are planning elections for the Constituent Assembly, because we bring with us this independent assessment using our scorecard and our criteria to help the country see how they're evaluated against international best practices and norms. The second, as we deepen our approach, is the policy improvement process. And this is a process for engaging countries that have already reached a certain level of performance in order to qualify for a compact, but where ongoing reform is critical. And so we're being increasingly selective and targeted, and we're deepening our engagement with countries that are working to reform. So I'll just mention briefly the situation in Honduras. They successfully completed their first compact, and based on their experience, they are extremely interested in qualifying for a second. So we're using that opportunity to engage them in several areas of the criteria focused on anti-corruption and human rights. And we're working with others across the U.S. government, where they're the lead. So human rights, obviously that's the State Department. On corruption, we're working with the government to assess the actions, to supplement our scorecard. So we're deepening our tools past the scorecard to find more fine-grained analysis of things that the government is doing on corruption, things that are more sensitive. So we're bringing a very serious discipline focus to benchmarking, measuring progress along the way. The third area, and this I'm delighted to hear about the interest in the Threshold Program, is our revised Threshold Program. And here we had a systematic review of the programs and our objectives. And we're building on lessons and our achievements in the first generation of programs. And we've designed a new concept. You can see on our website there's a document called Lessons Learned in the Threshold Program. And while it doesn't lay out the new concept completely, it talks about the elements, the issues that we're trying to address moving forward.
As you know, the board decided to reinstate Niger's Threshold Program. So we're really looking forward to assessing the policy conditions that exist there now to see if any elements of the old program still make sense, but also to apply some of our new diagnostic tools to identifying policy areas, doing some political economy analysis to see how feasible these policies are in the time frame that we're working in, which is 3 to 4 years, and designing the programs based on those deep diagnostics. So MCC is going to increase its involvement in the program design process, partnering with USAID, which was the implementer in the last program. We're also going to build in greater measures of oversight during implementation. And this is all based on the review, and you can see details about this on our website. The third piece is building in incredibly robust monitoring and evaluation practices into our Threshold Program. Just like the discipline that we apply to compacts, we're going to bring that into the Threshold Program. And the fourth area that we talked to the board about is policy reform in compacts and how our approach has evolved. We're sharpening our focus on integrating reforms into the compacts to improve governance, to increase the sustainability of our investments, and to increase our impact. And I mean, when we talk about results, we're talking about increasing the economic rates of a return. So how are we doing this? We're increasing our focus on these activities so that they're identified, developed, invested in, and monitored and evaluated in the same discipline as other types of investments in compacts. You can see this approach illustrated in 2 recent compacts. The CEO mentioned Malawi, so let me talk about Malawi for a moment. We started with a constraints analysis, an analysis of their economy. This identified the energy sector as a binding constraint to growth. We then conducted deeper sectoral analysis that revealed investing in infrastructure wasn't enough. Inadequate institutions are a key constraint. And so we integrated sector policy and institutional reforms in the program design. We applied the same focus on due diligence work into the policy reform component during compact development. We developed a targeted monitoring and evaluation system to measure the results of these reforms. And this is going to keep the focus on these reforms and increase visibility on the reforms to local stakeholders. We're also seeking to leverage our investments with other partners. Other donors are now contributing to the energy sector, including an $83 million credit from the World Bank. Within the USG, we're partnering with USAID, USTDA, and the Department of Energy. Internationally, working with the IMF, IFC, DFID, JICA, and Norway. Investing in these reforms reduces the risk in the infrastructure investment itself, substantially increases the impact of our investment. And I'm looking at our Vice President for Compact Development, for Compact Operations, and I'm sure he'd be happy to chime in with any answers to questions you might have. Let me also just mention the example of the Philippines. We have a different approach that we applied here. It's a standalone reform project focused on tax administration. This, too, emerged from our constraints analysis, where they identified government revenue as a binding constraint to growth. We invested heavily in institutional due diligence, and we built upon the activities of the Threshold Program, which focused in the same area. This analysis included leveraging other partners, and so here, too, we're working with the IMF, an institution acknowledged for its expertise. Again, we developed a dynamic monitoring and evaluation. And the project's high economic rate of return reflects the fact that the component in and of itself is expected to accelerate growth in the country. So those are 2 different kinds of examples of how we're implementing this commitment to reform and integration in our compacts. Let me turn to the results slide. This is a third principle in our approach. I talked about the ways that our programs have been developed through a very diagnostic-driven approach that's going to apply to thresholds as well as compacts. And we're also bringing it into our engagement in the policy improvement process, which isn't really a programmatic investment, but more of a dialogue. Finally, focused on monitoring and evaluation. We're increasing the robustness of our evaluations in the Threshold Program and in compacts, and we're even applying some of these tools to our dialogue with countries through the policy improvement process. So that concludes my remarks. We're going to continue to work on our approach and build lessons learned, and I hope we'll have a principles into practice paper on policy in the fall. And we look forward to answering your questions. Thank you. Any questions? Over there?
Sorry.
Oh, well, we'll start here and then we'll move across the room.
Sorry. Hi, my name is John Whitehead. I'm from Trimble Navigation. And I had a question, a two-part question about the use of ERR in your project evaluation or project proposal evaluation. I'm curious to know how the technology and sort of the private sector is engaged in these studies, whether or not they are, and how we can go about interacting with MCC at the initial stages of the evaluation. And the second part of my question is, are there efforts in the MCC to update the models that are published online?
Well, let me answer the second question. Patrick, may I pass you the program development question? So our economists are working to update models so that even our estimates are revised as conditions change in the country, and that's an ongoing effort. So please stay tuned and stay focused on our website. Do you want to answer first?
As Sherry said, when we start to work with once a country is selected as eligible for a compact, we get into a discussion with that country. And the first step is a constraints analysis, which is a broad macroeconomic diagnostic to look at where are the constraints to growth. And it usually identifies 2 or 3 priority areas. And we, the government then will cross-check that with its national development plans, and it will identify which of these priority areas it really wants to focus on. Then there's a period of broad consultation, which includes a lot of outreach to the private sector working in that country. So if your question about how does the private sector get involved, my advice would be if there's a country where we're developing a compact or that's been selected as eligible for a compact, to get involved in the consultation process that goes on as part of that compact development right at the beginning. And I mean, Zambia is a good example where one of the areas that the Zambia Compact is going to work on is development of enterprises and private sector operations around the Kafue National Park. And there's been tremendous outreach to the private sector in Zambia and in Southern Africa around working in park concessions, working in the development of the buffer areas, buffer zones around parks. And that consultation has been extremely valuable in things like development of a law that governs work in that area in the country. So there's a very robust process of consultation. It's not with the private sector, with civil society, that takes place when we develop a compact.
We'll take this one over here, and then we'll go to the lady I promised earlier.
Hi, Ed Barber again, GoodWorks. This is Andrew Young's consulting firm. And we are very interested in the way the Threshold Program works. I've seen reports recently that the budget environment is going to result in some significant constraints, particularly on the Threshold Program. Is there, and I assume that's an influence on the way you're redesigning it. Can you speak a little more about that?
Sure. I mean, budget constraints are going to have to impact our program decisions and the selection of countries that we work with. But we do hope to have a country that we can work with in December. We envision that the programs will be smaller than in the past, and this is because one of the conclusions from the review is that we invested in many policy areas, and within those policy areas we had many components and activities. And so we want to focus our efforts a little bit more. And so we think that we'll be more narrowly targeting policy areas, and the programs will likely be smaller. But I think that in the review, we also concluded, and the board concluded, that this is a valuable tool for promoting reform in countries, and that we have a very significant incentive. And this is repeated to us by our colleagues in the embassies and the aid missions and civil society on a regular and ongoing basis. So we think it's a valuable tool, but we think the reform's the important part, not necessarily how fat the programs are.
Morning, Jamie Bay from DevX. I believe you were mentioning with the Malawi Compact, you were talking a little bit about partnerships with other donor agencies, both U.S. federal agencies as well as other bilaterals, and I know in previous compacts other multilaterals have been involved. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about how that partnership works. I know in previous cases there may be a World Bank project where MCC will pick up, additional infrastructure work off of that, or if now there's also sort of a dialogue up front as MCC metrics are coming together of saying, okay, this donor's taking on this piece, this donor's taking on this piece. Sort of how does that play out?
Well, as part of our compact development process, both we and the country are consulting with other partners and other donors, and we're not the first to work in or to try to tackle the energy sector in Malawi. The World Bank has a long history there. So in doing our due diligence, that they were an obvious consultation partner. And so we worked with them to think through what are the kinds of reforms that would be appropriate. We consulted with other donors, so did the government's MCA team. And so this process happens not at the end of the road, but very early on in the development process. And like I said, the energy sector is a key constraint in Malawi, and it emerged very early on in the process. So there's been a very in-depth dialogue with all of these countries, and so international and other partners. And so some of them are making their own investments alongside. Some of them are part of our project. And we work together in a collaborative process with the government of Malawi in the lead, driving this to think about how we can leverage other investments. This woman here, and then the woman in pink.
Thank you very much. Paula Feeney from Cargno, and I have two hopefully quick questions. Sherry, for you, with respect to your partnership with USAID down the road with the Threshold Program, I think congressionally mandated initially, at least, AID was the go-to partner to execute the Threshold Program. As you reinvigorate or reinstate that program, do you expect that AID will be your exclusive partner on that, or is that all up for redesign and rethinking? And the second question for Ginny Seitz, AID has recently beefed up with at least 2 senior persons to come in and to get busier and more effective in the gender arena. How would you characterize the relationship between what you're doing and describing and where AID is on whatever curve you think you're on, and how would you characterize that collaboration and moving forward between the 2 agencies? Thank you.
So first, on the Threshold Program, we have had a history of working with USAID, but it has never been our exclusive partner. We've worked with other agencies, including the Office of Technical Assistance at the Treasury Department, the Department of Justice, and others. And so, and the legislation suggests that USAID is a potential partner, but it's certainly not something that's mandated. And so we've had programs that were exclusively with other agencies, such as in Sao Tome. Going forward, MCC is going to be a much more robust participant in the process. So it's most important that the country leads the process, because when we're talking about these kinds of changes, it must be driven by the dynamics and the conditions in the country. So they're the first partner. We certainly will look to work with USAID and other government partners. How programs will be implemented in the future will be based on what are the kinds of reforms that we're focused on. So if we think about the kinds of things that we're even looking at in Honduras, it's not a threshold country, but we're focused on public and public financial management. Well, Treasury would be a natural ally if we, on a topic like that on government transparency. So it will really depend on what emerges from these diagnostics, and we certainly hope that USAID will continue to be a part of that process.
Thank you. Just as I noted the leadership and commitment in this agency, clearly this administration has made a difference overall in terms of attention to gender. And that is happening within USAID, and we're very pleased that both Karen Groen and Carla Koppel are in those leadership positions, and both of them have worked with us for quite some time. And we are really looking forward to deepening our collaboration. I've gone over and met with Karen's team that's working on policy development. We've had many conversations about the Partnerships for Growth process, and so we're very excited about these developments. What I can say for MCC is that we're really positioned in terms of our model and our approach and our focus to achieve gender integration in these economic sectors, and I think we're really moving forward in that regard, and I think that we will join with our partners at USAID and move forward together in many respects. And then I just wanted to add on to Sherry's answer about Malawi, about donor coordination that came up a little bit earlier, and go back to Patrick's example of Zambia, where there has been intensive consultation and cooperation and coordination with the donors, for example, that are engaged in the environment and nature-based tourism sector with Zambia. Zambia wants to move out of its dependence on extractive industries and wants to see is committed to the growth of tourism opportunities. And the other donors have been engaged in this, and we have been really important partners with them, and together we're pushing some, I think, significant policy reform as well. So that's been very positive.
There was a woman back there in pink.
Good morning. My name is Esther Ejim. I'm from Niger Worldwide Charities Incorporated. My question is for you. I was listening to the gender integration topic that you were talking about, and I wanted to know what is the selection criteria? When you deal in when you go to a country, is it on a case-by-case basis, or is it part of a country package? Since MCC deals with a nation, because there are some areas in the world where the women are, of course, marginalized and they are relegated to the background. They don't make decisions. So what happens when that country does not qualify, to be in your program? Do you deal with the women directly or what? Thank you.
So I think I will tackle the first part, which I think is about how we choose partners. So MCC has a range of different policy areas that we look at for countries to qualify, and they don't need to meet the criteria on all of them to qualify. And so we have had circumstances where a country's performance on, let's say, the land rights and access indicator, where there might be low performance or a lack of land rights or access to women. And so it's sort of a two-part assessment. The first part is looking at their overall policy environment. And again, we have had some challenges with some of the countries that we work with. And then we turned it over to the gender analysis team and the country team to look at what are constraints to investment. So let me turn it over to Ginny.
Sherry, a country has to qualify. You know, we're not going to work with.
Right.
There are many countries where women might.
Microphone.
I mean, you can make the point, but I think that's the question.
Yeah. The question is about qualification for MCC. Sure. So the country has to be selected by the board, and they do a very detailed analysis and discussion about overall performance in the country. And we want to choose countries that are willing to undertake the kinds of reforms, even after they qualify, that would help them develop and grow.
So, for example, we did influence a major change in a legal change in Lesotho by essentially conditioning our assistance on a legal change that made married women full economic actors or legal adults in that country. So that was an important step for the country and for us. I think your other question was what do you do when women are so marginalized they can't really participate? And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation about Nicaragua, consultations with civil society, analysis of what the policy and institutional constraints might be, ensuring that there's capacity for gender analysis in all aspects of developing a program are part of the standard practice. In fact, if you look at our gender policy, it says that consultation is the first entry point and an ongoing measure of how well we're doing gender integration. So we do understand the barriers that women and marginalized peoples face, and we do understand that in the end, economic growth has to touch them in some way, and we pay very close attention to it.
Are there any other questions? Oh, in the back there, and then up front.
Good morning, Tanya Giannoni from DevTech. On the question of the Threshold Program and your due diligence, I'm trying to understand sort of the process and the steps because I'm somewhat familiar with the São Tomé program. Is the due diligence done before or after you select your partner for implementing? Because I think that that's actually a key element of the due diligence and not necessarily defining it just by sort of the technical capabilities of the partner. So I offer that as a recommendation in order to achieve your results.
Thank you. So in determining a country that might be a good partner for the Threshold Program, we're really looking for countries that the person that would implement the program.
I understand the issue of the selection for the country, but I meant the implementing partner. The partner, like for example, whether it's USAID, OTA, Treasury, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. So going forward, we expect to see some changes in how the programs will be implemented and how, and we might see changes in who oversees procurement processes. In the past, the determination of what agency we might partner with, it has been based on the policy area that we're focused in, and generally those institutions have done the procurement. Going forward, there will be some changes. So I take your point about due diligence and how we arrange these programs, and I think they'll be probably smaller and more focused going forward. And we're looking forward to putting some new information about the threshold concept on our web very soon.
Jay Grover, Center for Global Development, Rethinking U.S. Foreign Assistance Program. I want to press you a little bit more on what Sarah Jane asked earlier. It seems that the biggest change seems to be this targeting the policy reforms, matching the instrument to the specific reform, and you kind of alluded to it's going to be almost necessarily smaller amounts of money. But many of these ideas, especially on what's on the board behind you, are very familiar. Is this targeting the main takeaway of the change in the threshold program? And what evidence is there that this new approach will be more effective than the previous approach?
Sure, thank you. So one of the key findings that I didn't talk about today from the threshold review, but I've talked about before and which is available on our website through this lessons learned document, is that the previous threshold program really targeted all of the indicators that a country wasn't passing in order to help them pass those indicators and qualify for a compact. And one of the lessons that we've learned is that it's very difficult to link our the impact of our programmatic intervention on changes in the indicators. And there's a lot of variation in our indicators, and certainly a lot of, and that impacts how much impact we can have through a programmatic intervention. So for example, many of our programs were focused on anti-corruption and governance. And that indicator is a measure of experiential and perception surveys. So the idea that improvements that we make, and we have made improvements, streamlining processes, increasing transparency, reducing opportunities for corruption, so we can have an impact with our program, but that may not impact the country's score. And so we're trying to use a different approach, a different diagnostic tool to identify what are the critical barriers for this country's eligibility and for their growth. And using a constraints analysis process, very similar to what we use in Compact, which is just a method of analyzing a problem situation to determine what the right intervention is. So we're going to apply this constraints analysis to the threshold problem. So what are the policies and other changes that would be necessary to impact growth and also to impact eligibility, right? Because the goal of the program hasn't changed. The purposes in our legislation were to help countries to become eligible. And we think that by working with a country on the kinds of reforms that will emerge from this analysis, we'll be able to demonstrate to the board that this is a partner committed to reform and able to work in a compact process. So we'll get two kinds of information from our work, in addition to reducing a constraint to growth and addressing a policy problem.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and insight. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming today, and also remind you that we are, all the latest developments on MCC and the status of our programs and operations go right up on our website. So please check out the website if you have questions. Let us know if you have questions moving forward. Also, a video and a transcript of this meeting will be posted on our website as well. So thanks again for coming, and we'll see you soon.